We have a lot to talk about, and it is my hope that by the time the day has concluded, we will not simply have talked. A number of people will have been inspired, encouraged, given new hope, but of equal importance that a number of people will have discerned how then they can go and do something constructive and positive. Now I want to read you some letters, and that might sound dull and unattractive. I think you will find that the opposite is the case. I'm going to read rather hurriedly, yet at the same time not too quickly, because we have some very fine interpreters in a booth there who want to translate into Spanish for those in the other room. This letter was written to me by a lady here who lives here in New York, but she wrote it to me from an airport out in Kansas. Dear Cardinal O'Connor, I don't know why I'm writing you, perhaps in confession, or perhaps in joy, but I feel a certain compulsion to do so. I am at this moment sitting in Kansas City International Airport, awaiting my flight home to New York. I came here to have an abortion, since there's a doctor that performs abortions here through the 26th week of pregnancy. I had made an appointment a month ago, but my conscience wouldn't allow me to keep the appointment. As the weeks approached, number 26, my commitment to abortion became more and more confused. Why was I going to do this? First, I should tell you that I'm 34, going on 35, no teenager. I have 2 children, 16 and 2.5, and all the trappings of a material middle-class life. A 3rd child, although unexpected, isn't going to break us. My concerns were more about my baby's health. I received many letters telling me the very same thing. But this lady says the first time I saw an obstetrician was late August, and by then I was estimated to be at my 25th or 26th week of pregnancy. I knew that was impossible. I later had a sonogram that revealed that I was 20 weeks pregnant. At that point, I'd had no prenatal care, and what really bothered me was that during the baby's crucial development, I'd been drinking a moderate amount of alcohol, just not taking care of myself. I feared Down syndrome. My obstetrician refused my request for amniocentesis since, as he said, I couldn't do anything about it anyway. But I just needed to know, since the risk was greater now. She goes on then to tell me about the illness and death of her father during this period that made it even more difficult for her. And she says, well, it was getting late, and unfortunately, not being poor, I could afford the $2,400 plus airfare and expenses to see the abortionist in Kansas. I arrived here yesterday morning still confused, but knowing that this would be it, my so-called last option. This person, it bothers me that I should label him doctor or physician, this person's office gave his name with the title Family Medicine. That struck me so. He had a rather large private building, and by medical standards, I would assume a thriving practice. He did a sonogram measuring my child's head. We didn't exchange a single word. His assistant introduced him by name. I stared into the monitor as he took 2 photographs. He completed the sonogram and asked, "Is this what you want to do?" I replied, "I've contemplated this for over a month," and asked him what risks I would be subject to, or what risks the child would be subject to if I had the child. Cardinal O'Connor, many Catholics do not believe in Satan as emissaries, but when that man turned around, his presence evoked such evil, one could truly feel the power of an evil force. He retorted, quotes, "I'm not in the business of counseling, I'm in the business of abortion." My God, have mercy on this man's soul. Cardinal O'Connor, you've seen those street peddlers on Madison and Fifth Avenues clear out when the police appear. Clearly, Jesus had me packing up at those words. It's funny now. I dressed myself. As he said, you may or may not have an abortion. If you want to have an abortion, be here tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. I heard him, but as I sought to control my New York temper, I wondered, how does this man sleep at night? He called for his assistant and requested $75 for the sonogram. I left his office and headed to another to pay his fee. As I walked out, he repeated that I might or might not be there at 8 o'clock. I'm just thinking to myself, the abortion business. Why doesn't he have a sign outside the building? So-and-so, MD, abortion business, instead of family medicine. Family medicine, what deception. I wonder, does he write abortionist as occupation on his tax return or on his children's school records? My goodness, I don't think the executioner at Utah State Prison claims that he's in the execution business. I paid the fee and I was advised to bring $2,325 in cash the next day for the quotes procedure. I knew where I was headed for, home. But it saddened me to think of what could have happened and how many children had died at the hands of this individual. When I walked out of the door, I saw some literature and picked it up. It was from Now in Kansas, extolling the problems of abortion clinic bombings. Perhaps that's why I thought of you. When I stood outside, I thought of the murderous activity inside. I mean, I don't wish that his staff or even his abortion business be harmed, but I'd love to see that site decimated. Yet I realize that he isn't the only one. By the way, this guy had been board certified in family medicine, not in obstetrics and gynecology. I wondered how many $2,400 will he take before he realizes that he's not in the abortion business, but in the death business. I'm glad to be going home, both of us. Truly, God has taught me a lesson well worth the expense. He knew what it would take for silly, stupid me to see the truth that in 14 weeks I'll have a baby. Thank you for taking the time. Please pray for my baby's health. And then to abortion. She signs the letter and gives me her address. And I have been in touch with her. She's one of many such people who write to me. Perhaps the most thrilling I've ever received was from a young woman who told me that she was literally en route to an abortion clinic that very day to have an abortion. And she heard me in an interview on radio. She heard me talking about what we believe to be the real meaning of abortion. She turned around and drove home, and she has since had her baby. read this to you, I read you this letter, I remind you of other letters, so that you will not give up hope. As Chris Bell noted, as Monsignor Woolsey noted, it's been a long, hard road. There's a long, hard road ahead. But we simply can't afford to give up hope. It is enormously important that every one of us here believe that if we have 1,000 people here today or something of that sort, and if every one of us here worked for the rest of our lives, day in and day out, and we saved only one life, every moment that we would have spent would be worth it. This is not a body count. We're talking about human life. One human life is precious, sacred to Almighty God. I want to read to you from an extraordinary passage in the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, the book of the going out of the Israelites after slavery to the Egyptians. We're told a new king came to the throne of Egypt who felt no obligation to the descendants of Joseph. He told his people, these Israelites are becoming dangerous to us because there are so many of them. Sounds familiar. Let's figure out a way to put an end to this. If we don't, and war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us and escape out of the country. So the Egyptians made slaves of them and put brutal taskmasters over them to wear them down under heavy burdens while building the store cities. Excuse me. But the more the Egyptians mistreated and oppressed them, the more the Israelis seemed to multiply, and the Egyptians became alarmed and made the Hebrew slavery more bitter still, forcing them to toil long and hard in the fields, to carry heavy loads of mortar and brick. And then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, instructed the Hebrew midwives to kill all Hebrew boys as soon as they were born, but to let the girls live. But the midwives feared God and didn't obey the king. They let the boys live too. The king summoned them before him and demanded, "Why have you disobeyed my command? And let the baby boys live." "Sir," they told him, "the Hebrew women have their babies so quickly that we can't get there in time. They're not slow like the Egyptian women." God blessed the midwives. So the people of Israel continued to multiply and to become a mighty nation. And because the midwives revered God, he gave them children of their own. And then Pharaoh commanded all of his people to throw the newborn Hebrew boys into the Nile River, but the girls, he said, could live. There were at this time a Hebrew fellow and girl of the tribe of Levi who married and had a family, and a baby son was born to them. And when the baby's mother saw that he was an unusually beautiful baby, she hid him at home for 3 months. Then, when she could no longer hide him, she made a little boat from papyrus reeds, waterproofed it with tar, put the baby in it, and laid it among the reeds along the river's edge. The baby's sister watched from a distance to see what would happen to him. Well, this is what happened. A princess, one of Pharaoh's daughters, came down to bathe in the river. And as she and her maids were walking along the riverbank, she spied the little boat among the reeds and sent one of the maids to bring it to her. And when she opened it, there was a baby, and he was crying. And this touched her heart. "He must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. And then the baby's sister approached the princess and asked her, "Shall I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" Yes, do, the princess replied. So the little girl rushed home and called her mother. Take this child home and nurse him for me, the princess instructed the baby's mother, and I will pay you well. So she took him home and nursed him. Later, when he was older, she brought him back to the princess, and he became her son. She named him Moses, meaning to draw out, because she had drawn him out of the water. And it was Moses who led the Israelites out from slavery to the Egyptians. And it was Moses who built the Israelites into a great nation to populate the world. And it was from the Israelites that Christ was born. And so it was because the life of Moses was saved in the providence of God that we can say we are here today, that the church exists all over the world. We could say in a very real sense that it was because Moses' life was saved, one baby was drawn from the water, that such almost incredible things are happening in Eastern Europe, that the faith can emerge once again, that all the great works of the church can flourish because one baby, one, was saved. I look back there and I see Sister Diane Krasinski with Rosalie Hall. How many babies have they saved at Rosalie Hall? On the 15th of October, 1984, I announced publicly and have announced the same thing repeatedly that any woman of any color, of any religion, of any ethnic background, from anywhere, can come to Catholic Charities in the Archdiocese of New York, and if she is in need, everything will be done. All medical assistance, all hospitalization, all legal help, all counseling will be provided free of charge. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of babies have been saved in this fashion. So do you and I really have a right to get discouraged? We speak of the 1.5 million babies whose lives are taken from them year after year. Do we speak enough of the countless numbers of babies whose lives have been saved by people like you right here, by people like Joan Andrews, who's again in jail, by people like Bishop Vaughn. And speaking of Joan Andrews and Bishop Vaughn and so many of you like them and so many all over, let me read to you a letter that you might or might not initially recognize, but then I'll tell you who wrote it in case you don't, and where he was when he wrote it. This is only a portion of it. He's writing to clergy. He says, you express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. The man who wrote that letter went on to become a Nobel Peace Laureate. He wrote it from a Birmingham jail, and his name was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. I have just reread the extraordinary letters of Joan Andrews from prison. It is not for me to recommend for or against personal involvement in Operation Rescue or in any kind of similar activity. That's a matter of individual commitment, individual conscience, individual choice. I do believe in pro-choice. If people choose to go to prison, I think they have a perfect right to do so. But whether or not this is for me, whether or not is for anyone here, I was appalled to read a letter the other day that talked about the great harm that Bishop Vaughn is allegedly doing to the pro-life cause. And what hurt most in the letter was its utter absurdity for anyone who knows a Bishop Vaughn or a Joan Andrews. The letter writer said, "It is time we stopped doing things just to please the Pope." It sounds very much like Bishop Vaughn. Let's talk for just a few moments about law. This is very informal. This is not I had thought that today I might try to give a so-called major public policy address that might attract some national attention and be published in all the right places. I even asked my good friend, Monsignor Bill Smith, who in my judgment is one of the outstanding and most reliable moral theologians in the United States. I asked him for assistance, telling him that I might try to prepare a very formal public policy address. So he provided me a great deal of highly incisive material that I couldn't understand. So, no, that's not true. He presents the most sophisticated moral theological thinking in very straightforward, easily understandable terminology. But I decided that rather than do that, I wanted to be with you. I wanted to express my gratitude to you. I wanted to encourage you. I just wanted to be one with you and not talking at you. So this reason, I decided this would not be a formal address, but I would just talk with you informally. So let's talk for a few moments about law and the meaning of law. Dr. Martin Luther King, Baptist minister, not a Catholic theologian, not a Catholic bishop, is very clear in discerning the distinction between a just law and an unjust law. Very simply, an unjust law is in dissonance with, in discord with, in dissent from, in contradiction to divine law, which is transmitted to us not only through our religious faith, not only through the commandments, but to every human person through what we call the natural moral law. It runs through all things. In a certain sense, there's nothing terribly mysterious about it. It's not quite the same thing as the natural physical law, but there are enough similarities to help us understand. There's a law that we call gravity. It pulls everything down. If I hold this piece of paper, I'm holding it up against the law which tends to pull it down. Now you know what will happen. Common sense tells you. If I take my hand away, there's nothing mysterious. The paper will fall. There's a moral law which runs through all being, all human persons. It's that law in accordance with which we are in union with, in harmony with the mind, with the will of God. To violate it is unnatural. It's a contradiction of our own natures. I don't think that unless one has been propagandized, as has happened in the United States, unless millions and millions and millions of dollars have been spent to convince you to the contrary, and most importantly, unless the whole nature of civil law in our country has conspired to convince you to the contrary, you don't need any complicated explanations. You don't need any extensive education. You don't need to be a Catholic, a Jew, a Lutheran, or a Hottentot to know that it is unnatural for a woman to let her baby be put to death. That is unnatural. But what has happened in large measure because of the law, not only the formal propaganda over television, in the newspapers, in magazines, the steady drumbeat of propaganda, not only that, but because of the law that tells us it's all right. And we must remember that from childhood, we are brought up to believe that it is the law which tells us what is right or what is wrong. We may disobey it, but the law says you're supposed to stop at a red light or proceed at a green light. We become accustomed to that. We grow up in that. So if the law says that something is all right, and you have no other moral training, which is the case with so many, many people, including Catholics, tragically, then that comes to be your norm. That comes to be natural for you. Consequently, one can have such a contradictory thing as a set of poll results telling us that 55% of the women who say that they believe abortion is murder, their term, not mine, 55% of those who say they believe abortion is murder say they believe it is a woman's right. Now that is unnatural, but it has been made, quotes, natural by the law and by the propaganda. And this is why law must be changed. It's as basic as that. And it is a charade to say that law cannot be changed. is a charade to say that law will make no difference. For some reason, I must confess I cannot begin to understand. There are those who tell us now we're not allowed to compare this with the previously existing laws on slavery, which declared black persons non-persons. They say we're not allowed to use that. Why? That's a purely arbitrary determination on the part of the pro-abortionists. No, you can't use that example. And then there are some who will go so far as to say, well, why are you using that example? Because it wasn't the Catholic priests who fought against slavery, it was Protestant ministers. Well, God bless the Protestant ministers. What's that have to do with the argument? That's nonsense. That's an absurdity. Sheer absurdity. But if there be some prone to believe that law can't do anything, and a change of a law won't mean anything, permit me to read to you from a speech which was given all the way back in 1966 at the White House Conference on Civil Rights. Remember, on civil rights. This speech was given by a man who was then the Solicitor General of the United States. He is now an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and his name is Thurgood Marshall. As Solicitor General of the United States at a civil rights conference at the White House, this is what he said about law. So I will attempt no assessment of how far we have come in regard to civil rights and blacks. Clearly, there remains a great deal of work in translating into concrete reality the rights already won, and new tools must still be forged. That is the goal of the proposed Civil Rights Act of 1966. There are, however, some lessons for the future in the history of the struggle for Negro rights. This is a man currently an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court who up to this point has not been famous for his pro-life advocacy. He says, what is striking to me is the importance of law in determining the condition of the Negro. He was effectively enslaved, not by brute force, but by a law which declared him a chattel of his master, who was given a legal right to recapture him, even in free territory. He was emancipated by law, and then disenfranchised and segregated by law. And finally, he is winning equality by law. Of course, law, Thurgood Marshall says, of course law, whether embodied in acts of Congress or judicial decisions, is in some measure a response to national opinion, and of course non-legal, even illegal events can significantly affect the development of the law. But I submit that the history of the Negro demonstrates the importance of getting rid of hostile laws and seeking the security of new friendly laws. What could be more reasonable? It's precisely what we're saying. We have hostile laws, laws that are hostile to the unborn, who by law has been declared a non-person for all practical purposes. So we have hostile laws. We want to get rid of the hostile laws. We want to bring about friendly laws. Thurgood Marshall goes on to say, provided there is a determination to enforce it, law can change things for the better. You have to have the determination to do it. Of course you can say, well, there's no point in trying to pass new laws because there's no national consensus. Then what you're saying is that you don't have the determination to try to bring that about. There's very little truth, says Marshall, in the old refrain that one cannot legislate equality. Laws not only provide concrete benefits, they can even change the hearts of men, some men anyway, for good or evil. Certainly, I think the history I have just traced about the civil rights movement makes it clear that the hearts of men do not change of themselves. And I'll read quickly, if the translators will forgive me, I'm going on awfully long. Of course, I don't mean to exaggerate the force of law, says Marshall. Evasion, intimidation, violence may sometimes defeat the best of laws, but to an important degree, they too can effectively be legislated against. The simple fact is that most people will obey the law, and some at least will be converted by it. What is more, the Negro himself will more readily acquiesce in his lot unless he has a legally recognized claim to a better life. He's saying something very important here. We accept the status quo. We adjust to the status quo. We become so calloused that we can say, I believe that abortion is murder, but I believe I should have the right to an abortion. That's 1984 think speak. That's Alice in Wonderland. But we become inured as those who understandably, because they want to try to save as many lives as possible, unwittingly create the effect that if a baby has been conceived by way of rape or incest, then it's expendable. No human life is expendable. So he says the Negro himself will more readily acquiesce in his lot, that is, in slavery or in the worst forms of segregation, unless he has a legally recognized claim to a better life. I think the segregation decision of 1954 probably did more than anything else to awaken the Negro from his apathy to demanding his right to equality. It seems to me that the experience under the recent Public Accommodations Law and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 proves the point. Of course there have been resistance and evasion and intimidation in both cases, but it must have surprised the cynics that so many restaurants in fact desegregated in obedience to the law, and more so that so many Negroes in Alabama and elsewhere are actually voting less than a year after the Voting Act was passed. And I am absolutely convinced that if the law about abortion were changed and young women came to realize you don't have to have an abortion, it's not a requirement, it's not the thing to do, it's no longer the fad, in fact, it's now illegal, the number of abortions would diminish very rapidly, very rapidly. I'll conclude what Justice Marshall says. He says, I do not suggest a complacent reliance on the self-executing force of existing laws. Of course not. In my judgment, we have, and I perhaps shouldn't say this, but I'm noted for saying what I shouldn't say. We have done a terrible job of education, a terrible job. Within the Catholic Church, I'm talking about. So those who say to us, you want us to change things by law, you're not teaching your people or they wouldn't be doing these things, to that degree they are right. The difficulty is that we are pushing this rock uphill all the time. We are confronted with the tidal wave of pornography on television, of all of the anti-family values on television and in the newspapers and the magazines, and then with a law which says that it's all okay. That's very difficult to teach against. But we still haven't done the job that we should have done and that we must yet do. But the difficulties have been enormous at any rate. Douglas says, I don't suggest a complacent reliance on the self-executing force of existing laws. On the contrary, I advocate more laws and stronger laws. And the passage of such laws requires untiring efforts. It was a long time for the civil rights movement, longer for the civil rights movement than it has been for us. We don't want to forget that. Just as Supreme Court decisions on the so-called white primary, restrictive covenants, and school segregation provided the impetus for the stepped-up protests of Negroes, we must use the present tools not as an end, but rather as additional incentive to restudy and renew our drive toward ending the gap between theory and practice, and in our own church. In our own church. Moreover, laws have only limited effect if they are not vigorously enforced. What I do say is that I have faith in the efficacy of law. Perhaps that's because I'm a lawyer and not a missionary, but I think history, which proves so many things, proves me right. I am unaware that Associate Justice Thurgood Marshall has retracted those remarks, although we have become accustomed to having people retract the embarrassing. I'm not going to use any names. Indeed, I'm going to disguise the names, and I can assure you that the people you will think of aren't the people that I'm talking about. But I want to read you just a couple of paragraphs from a letter that was written to me several years ago. It was an honor and a great privilege meeting you this morning. This is addressed to me. I am grateful for the time you took from what I know must be a hectic schedule to see us. I hope you will continue to speak out on abortion and those issues we all feel so strongly about in the future. As a politician representing such and such, but also as a father of X number of children, I recognize the important role the church plays in our everyday lives. I was fortunate to be the beneficiary of a sound Catholic education, first in a Catholic grade school, secondly a Catholic high school, thirdly in a Catholic college. I repeat, I hope you will continue to speak out on abortion and those issues we all feel so strongly about in the future. The writer of the letter, after writing the letter, decided not only that he would become pro-choice, but expressed his keen distress that bishops are speaking out too forcibly on abortion and matters of public policy. So people do change their minds. There seems to be some attraction to do so. The American Bar Association recently gave all sorts of evidence that it is prepared to change its mind after all of these years of at least refraining from submitting any kind of a resolution. As you know, recently a resolution was passed for the American Bar Association, which is called pro-choice. If enough lawyers are concerned, that can be turned back this summer. But since we become so accustomed to not wanting to impose our morality on others, since we become so accustomed to living in a so-called pluralistic society, which means you can kill or not kill as you wish, then it's going to take a tremendous amount of energy which I'm pleased to say some lawyers are currently exercising to turn that ABA, American Bar Association resolution around. Indeed, I have heard some lawyers say, oh, the church shouldn't get into that now. Church shouldn't get into that. We're creating enough trouble already. The American Medical Association had very quietly passed what I consider to be an anti-life resolution back in December, got no notice whatsoever, and yet In accordance with the law today, in accordance with the law, not one single abortion should be performed in the United States that's not performed by a doctor. Where is the tremendous protest? I know some magnificent Catholic doctors who are fighting every day in the cause of life. But we have a huge number of Catholic doctors in the United States. I haven't seen many marches for life packed with thousands of Catholic doctors. And yet not one abortion, in accordance with the law, could be performed except by a doctor. I would like to believe not only that none of our Catholic doctors perform abortions, I would like to believe that every Catholic doctor will now address the American Medical Association, representing him or her, and say, no. We have been in discussion with the officials of the AFL-CIO because it had gone far beyond the rumor stage that a pro-choice resolution was to be proposed in the belief that it would be approved by the membership of the AFL-CIO. To date, wiser heads have prevailed to a degree so that at least the proposed resolution is under study. As I wrote in a recent Catholic New York column, it's absolutely inconceivable to me that people who died in the mines because of the greed and the contempt for life on the part of some of the big so-called collieries and railroad interests, or that others whose ancestors were literally beaten in efforts to break strikes, or who had to march, give up their jobs to try to win a penny an hour to improve the situation of their family. It's inconceivable to me that unionism would not be absolutely in the forefront of the protection of human life. I will conclude in a few moments. I want to take exception to just a few things. First, to me, it is a charade that we're forced to listen to in so many speeches or read in so many papers, and then we ourselves become so fond of, that the church has no business talking about abortion because we're not doing enough for women, we're not doing enough for life, and we should be doing far, far more. And I know what we've been spending only on one program since the 15th of October in 1984 in the Archdiocese of New York in taking care of women who might be tempted to have an abortion. But that's a drop in the bucket. Our annual Catholic health care bill, obviously the majority of payments from third parties, but much of it having to be raised, our annual health care bill in the Archdiocese of New York is $1.3 billion, $1.3 billion, which includes 18 Catholic hospitals, all of them devoted to life, 14 Catholic child care homes, where we absolutely refuse to permit abortion counseling, and not one penny will change our minds. Ten Catholic nursing homes, the almost countless number of places, such as Rosalie Hall, that I've already remembered or already mentioned. This is being done every day. There's hardly a day that I'm not out begging, raising money, having breakfast in our residence, having receptions in our homes for the homeless, including homeless women, for the pregnant, for teenagers, against crack, for persons with AIDS. It has been my great privilege to have sat at the bedside of, washed the sores of, emptied the bedpans of more than 1,200 persons with AIDS, very many of them women, through the auspices of the Archdiocese of New York. It is a sheer calumny to imply that we are doing nothing for women, nothing for families, and therefore the church is responsible for abortion. As I'm told, I'm responsible for AIDS because I don't support the distribution of condoms. That, again, is Alice in Wonderland thinking. So we have to stop being apologetic. Monsignor Woolsey said that a friend who accompanied him to Washington said that we're kind of an excuse me people. We're trying to defend human life. If you see someone with a gun in someone else's head, you don't say, I know this is terribly impolite of me, and forgive me for my very existence, but you know, I'm going to call a policeman or something or other. This is for real. This is absolutely categorically for real. We are talking about real human beings who are destroyed, whatever their age. That's inconsequential. And we know, people have been telling this for a long time, this is going to happen, and Monsignor Smith will be talking about it later. We know, or we knew, that the slippery slope would go to work, and that if we destroyed the helpless in their mother's womb, then the day would come that we would be destroying the crippled, the blind, the cancer-ridden, the retarded, the wheelchaired. You think we won't? Take a look at the states considering assisted suicide legislation right now. Take a look at the number of groups who style themselves assisted suicide groups for persons with AIDS, who, quotes, have nothing to live for. It's what happens when we become calloused and contemptuous about human life. I conclude. God knows what good you have done against almost unbelievable odds. I think for the most part, the people who are mad at us are not mad because of the stereotype presented about Operation Rescue or other pro-life people as crazies, as fanatics. I don't think that's the primary reason. I think the primary reason that the resistance is so powerful and so aggressive is that beneath the surface, the overwhelming number of people are still good, decent people who, despite all the propaganda and despite the change in the laws, know there is something unnatural. There's something wrong with killing your baby. And it's terribly difficult for them to face that. They don't want killing words used. They want termination of pregnancy. They want removal of tissue. Not because they're evil, but because in kind of a radical sense, they're good. None of us, not one of us, likes to be confronted with being unnatural. That's the worst thing of all. And so we must be patient, and we must love. We must return hatred with love, hostility with compassion and understanding. But we must still be forthright. There can be no backing away. There can be no ambiguity. There can be no pretense about our position. And above all, there can be nothing apologetic about it. I said I hoped that we would leave here not only encouraged, inspired, with renewed hope, not only conscious that with saving one baby, we can be saving Moses. We can be saving a whole culture, a whole civilization. That because that woman drew that baby out of the waters that would have engulfed it, that the great nation of Israel sprang up. And we, the church, rooted in Israel, exist today. So we cannot be discouraged. We cannot give up. If we save one baby, let us be eternally grateful. But I said I hoped for even more than this, for a renewal of hope and encouragement and inspiration and information. I hope that some constructive action will follow. I offer you two possibilities within a few seconds. One, I have announced my commitment to establishing a religious community. I've called it Sisters of Life. I've been asked if I would accept men, and I said I would prayerfully consider this and then call it Servants of Life. I said I was looking for people with medical or legal backgrounds, but by no means was my search limited to that. People in every walk of life. People willing to spend some time in contemplation. People willing to be true religious in the true sense of the term. Vowed religious. Truly living a religious life. And people spending a significant part of their time in activism of one form or another, whether working in pregnancy clinics or distributing literature or doing whatever to try to save human lives. If you know anyone who might be free, whom God might be calling, I truly believe this apostolate is long overdue in the long history of religious life in the church. And this is what I invite to your consideration, to the consideration of any you might know. It will be a hard life, a life of activity, a life of prayer, a life of commitment and dedication. That brings me to my final comment. It may be very, very much better for you to go home, never to engage in any formal kind of pro-life activity. That may be much better for you, for your temperament, for your family, for your circumstances. Only you can determine that. There might be some of you here who could well engage in sidewalk counseling. There might be some of you here who, despite the potential penalties, might want to engage in Operation Rescue because you believe that's what you're called to do. But whatever, every single one of us can contribute enormously, indescribably, through prayer. We Catholics talk so much about prayer and tend to do so little of it. Would a rosary a day be too much? Would 3 Hail Marys a day be too much? Would the second half of the Hail Mary each day be too much? Let each of us pray in accordance with his, with her capabilities, temperament, and opportunities. But let all of us